This is the first in several lectures in which we are going to talk about the genre of traditional literature, which is one of my favorites. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. All right, so the purpose of this lecture is to just give you an overview of what traditional literature is, and other lectures are going to talk more specifically about the subgenres of traditional literature. So when we talk about traditional literature, we're talking about stories that have been passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. As you know, inventions like the internet and TV are relatively recent as far as human history goes. And before we had those forms of entertainment to pass on information about our culture and those cultural values, we had stories that people told to each other. So these stories have been told for many generations and are still being shared today, especially in the form of children's literature. So luckily, those stories from the past are still being passed on to new generations. And these stories, as old as they are, and many of their origins are unknown, and they've been changed throughout the years, these are enduring stories because they often contain truths about human existence that remain the same no matter what culture or what generation we're talking about. For example, kindness is a human trait that is important across cultures and I think will always be something important, as well as helping other peoples and other pro-social behaviors. Those are human characteristics that we want to pass on, human values that we want to share with future generations. And traditional literature shares these with each new generation. So traditional literature for some time was meant to convey a culture's history because they didn't necessarily have written language. It was also meant to pass on the values of a culture, and traditional stories were also used to entertain people because they didn't have the modern devices that we enjoy today. So traditional literature can take a few different forms, and we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more depth, but just to give you a sense of what they are. Fairy tales, myths, legends, tall tales, these are all forms of traditional literature. Those stories that have origins that span generations and generations back, and we're not really even sure who wrote them or who invented them originally. So there are a lot of things about traditional literature that children find appealing. And I'm going to use a well-known fairy tale, Cinderella, which I think a lot of people are familiar with because of the Disney movie, to talk through some of these characteristics of traditional literature. One is that traditional literature often includes stock characters. So these characters that are very single-minded and don't have a lot of dimension to them. For instance, Cinderella herself is a stock character. We don't really know a whole lot about her other than the fact that she's lonely and she is nice to other people. Whereas on the other hand, we have her stepsisters and they're just mean and they're jealous. We don't really know anything else about what motivates them. The action in fairy tales and other forms of traditional literature tends to move very quickly. Like, we don't spend a lot of time dwelling on Cinderella's bad situation in the story. I mean, we're introduced to the fact that she has no mother, she has a mean stepmother, mean stepsisters, and she has to do all of the family's chores. But then the story gets going. You know, we're not dwelling on the details here. It moves pretty quickly, and that's appealing because sometimes we just want to get to the point of the story. Traditional literature often includes fantasy elements. Like in Cinderella, we have a magic godmother or a fairy godmother who magically creates a dress and shoes for Cinderella to wear to the ball. And we often see other kinds of magical elements in other forms of traditional literature, like we see talking animals, or various other magical elements like goblins, fairies, things like that we wouldn't necessarily find in real life. And traditional literature often contains themes that are very basic but still appealing to young people. Like in Cinderella and many other traditional stories, we have the theme of good versus evil. Like in Cinderella, the kind, the good person, the good sister. Cinderella herself ends up triumphing over, her mean, jealous stepsisters and her stepmother. So there are lots of ways that you can teach with traditional literature in your classroom. Traditional literature is really great for introducing literary elements. For example, what's a character? What's a protagonist versus an antagonist? And these elements are usually very clear-cut in traditional literature. They're not very nuanced and not very well developed necessarily, but they're easy in terms of having kids be able to identify them. Like, it's pretty easy to define an antagonist as being like the bad guy or the unsavory character in a story and be able to relate that to Cinderella. Well, obviously the antagonist would be the wicked stepmother and the wicked stepsisters. And other literary elements like the plot and the setting, the story problem and the resolution, all of those are very easy to pick out with traditional literature. It's also a very useful genre for teaching about human values and character traits. As mentioned on one of the previous slides, we talked about how we have in traditional literature these stock characters that are motivated by a single thing or only have one or two character traits, like they're kind or they're evil. And that can teach students about what a character trait is because they're very easy to pick out with these traditional stories. One thing you might also think about doing is a family history unit with traditional literature, perhaps asking students' families to share stories that are true to their culture and bring them into the classroom. So that could fit very well when you're studying, for example, if you're studying immigration and you want to share students' cultural backgrounds, you could certainly bring in some traditional stories from students' own families. And traditional literature also really lends itself to comparing and contrasting because a lot of the time these traditional stories have variations across different cultures. Like, as we'll talk about in a little while in one of the other lectures, there are Cinderella type stories from cultures across the globe, from Native American cultures to Asian cultures to Middle Eastern cultures. And we don't really know which one is like the first or the original Cinderella story necessarily. But it's interesting to take those stories and compare how are the elements similar and how are they different. In fact, that's something that I did with my own students once with different Cinderella stories, and it was an activity that they really enjoyed. They especially liked hearing a familiar story with multicultural characters from around the world. So they really enjoyed taking what they knew of Cinderella and seeing how it's been told in a different way in other countries by other people living in other cultures. So when we evaluate traditional literature, we really can't look at it in the same way that we would look at realistic fiction, for example. So let's say in a work of realistic fiction, we'd want a plot that's nuanced, that's complex, we'd want rich characterization. We're just not going to find that in traditional literature because we have these stock characters. As mentioned before, in traditional literature, characters are usually motivated by just one thing, like their jealousy or their greed. Characters are stereotypes like the wicked stepmother as well as jealous siblings. Oftentimes with traditional stories, the character's physical appearance corresponds to his or her personality. Like in Cinderella, she's like very beautiful, but the wicked stepmother and the wicked or evil stepsisters are very ugly. One exception, would be, of course, the Snow White story where we have the queen who's very beautiful and Snow White who is also very beautiful. Although the queen is very ugly on the inside, she's beautiful on the outside, but not as beautiful as Snow White. Oftentimes as well in traditional literature, we have our protagonist, the hero of our story, is someone who's very isolated and very friendless. So we don't have like these richly developed characters that have both good points as well as flaws. Usually it's just like one way or the other. They're good or bad. So we can't really look at traditional literature in the same way that we would look at, say, historical fiction or realistic fiction or even modern fantasy stories. And when we look for quality traditional literature, we want to look for an interesting narrative. We want to make sure that the story is well told. One thing that a lot of children find appealing when they're listening to traditional literature would be repetitive refrains, the sorts of phrases that are repeated over and over again in the story. We also like an opening that gives us a sense of we're about to read a fairy tale, like once upon a time. We want our story to be set up, and we also want a conclusion to the story that is satisfying. We want our protagonist to have something good happen, and we want the antagonist of the story to pay for their evil behavior. And we also want to look for illustrations that match the tone of the text. And oftentimes we want to look for, especially when we're looking at multicultural traditional stories, we want to look for illustrations that are true to the culture that is being described in the story. So we would want to look for illustrators who have included some sort of cultural detail in their illustrations. And it's also important, especially when we are looking at multicultural traditional stories, that we look for authenticity as well as authority. So we want to make sure that when we're reading multicultural stories that the author has included some source notes. Now, of course, when we're dealing with traditional literature, the author of a children's book, that conveys a traditional story like a Cinderella or a Little Red Riding Hood should have some source notes indicating how the author found this story, like what other sources did he or she read about in order to come up with this particular variation of the story. So we want to see that the author has done his or her research and they didn't just, watch the Disney movie and write a story based on that. We want to see some research involved there. And with multicultural stories in particular, we want to be very critical about the research that the author has done. And another thing we might want to look at is whether or not the author, or we should really say the reteller of the traditional story, is a cultural insider, because sometimes traditional stories have been criticized for the fact that the person retelling the story is not a member of the cultural group and they get details that are not quite accurate. For example, Arrow to the Sun is an example of a traditional story. I think it's about the Pueblo Native American culture. And the author, Gerald McDermott, is not a Pueblo, and he gets a lot of details wrong in the story, and he's been very much criticized for that, even though his book, Arrow to the Sun, received the Caldecott Medal. So that's an issue that you need to be mindful of. So when you're evaluating a traditional story in children's book format, then that's something you need to look out for. Oftentimes there will be an author's note or information about the author and how the story was researched at the end of the story. So that's something you want to look for. So there are, of course, pros and cons with using traditional literature. Certainly because there are so many variations of familiar stories, we can promote cultural diversity and get students interested and more aware of other cultures from around the world. We can also use traditional literature to highlight human values that are common, like helping other people, being kind to others. Those are common human universal traits that we find in cultures everywhere. And we can also use traditional literature to expose children to literary archetypes. For example, the hero or the mentor. Those are types of characters that we see in stories, even today. For example, if you think of Star Wars, the mentor is clearly Yoda, right? The hero being Luke Skywalker or Han Solo. So those are types of characters that we see over and over again, and many of them we also see in traditional literature. So it can kind of be an interesting opportunity to compare, these archetypes that we see in traditional stories to maybe more modern characters that exemplify these particular types of archetypes. And as we mentioned before, literary elements and devices are also very clear-cut in traditional literature, so they're great. These stories are great for teaching those. But there are a lot of drawbacks to teaching with traditional literature. A lot of traditional stories that are written for children are often tempered and don't always include a lot of violence, but many of the original traditional stories are very violent. For example, if you think about Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf is eating the girl and her grandmother, and then the hunter comes and shoots the wolf and he cuts his stomach open. That's kind of disgusting. Or like if you think about Hansel and Gretel with the witch shoving Hansel into the oven because she wants to eat him later, that's pretty gross. So there is a lot of violence in them. But sometimes, in the versions that we share with children, like in picture book format, sometimes those violent elements are a little bit less obvious. But if you go to, versions of these traditional stories, for example, the Grimm stories that are more true to the original tales, they can be very violent and often grotesque. And of course, we have these stereotypes in traditional literature that can be very unfortunate, like the wicked stepmother. Well, not a lot of stepmothers are pretty great people, warm and loving people. They're not wicked. Of course, as with anything, there are good people and bad people, but generally speaking, stepmothers are not wicked people for the most part. And as we mentioned before, sometimes multicultural stories are not always authentic. So you need to make sure that the author has done research or the author is actually a member of the group that's being discussed.